This is my second video on AMD's new Ray Regeneration, which is their AI denoiser for upscaling, which seems to be designed to compete with Ray Reconstruction. And that's what we're going to investigate in this video. We're going to actually compare it with Ray Reconstruction. In my first video, I looked at a comparison of Ray Regeneration against the default denoiser, and I noticed that Ray Regeneration made the ray traced reflections look significantly sharper at only a very small loss to performance, so that seemed pretty good. But again, how does it stack up against Ray Reconstruction? Well, now that I've had more time, I did investigate, and this game also supports Ray Reconstruction. However, this is Call of Duty Black Ops 7, and this is not a kind of game I think a lot of people would use ray tracing in, and it also only has ray traced reflections, and it would be really cool to see this technology in more like seeing it in a global illumination sense, seeing what kind of the boiling in that can kind of look like at times. So this is really just the only game that supports both right now, and really the only game that supports Ray Regeneration. So that's why we're looking at it in this particular game, because that's all that's available right now for investigating it. Now, I popped in my 5070 Ti. I have the Asus Prime model. This was sent as a review sample around the launch of the 50 series. Kind of looks like this. I'll be running it out at its out-of-the-box settings. So if you're looking at temperatures and things like that, that's what you're looking at. It's the 5070 Ti Asus Prime at its out-of-the-box settings. And my 9070 XT, I was actually just sent a review model of the ASRock Monster Hunter Wilds edition, which apparently comes with a free game code for Monster Hunter Wilds if you get it before 12/31. Anyway, as far as what this one looks like, the back plate has a big Monster Hunter Wilds design. You got kind of like a color scheme that goes with that. But again, I'm running this at its out-of-the-box settings here, and both cards were sent as review samples. So there you go. Let's go ahead and jump into the actual testing. And let me go ahead and full screen this thing, and let's go for it. So on the left-hand side of the screen is the 5070 Ti. I'm going to make myself kind of tiny and out of the way, unless I need to point something out. I'm tiny. And on the right-hand side of the screen is the 9070 XT. I'll tell you as we change graphic settings, but what we're starting with is 4K output at maximum graphic settings. So extreme preset with ray tracing set to high, which is the highest it goes, but in performance mode upscaling. Now, for the 5070 Ti, I'm using DLSS 4's transformer model, and I'm using Ray Reconstruction on. On the right-hand side of the screen with the 9070 XT, we're using FSR 4 in its performance mode upscaling, with Ray Regeneration on. So we're using both of those technologies. Now, performance-wise, my 9070 XT ended this built-in benchmark run 14% faster, even though we have ray tracing on. But keep in mind that Call of Duty tends to be an AMD-favored title, and we're just looking at one particular game right now, so do keep that in mind when you're thinking about the performance differences here. Anyway, we want to be looking at, in addition to performance differences, one of the main things we want to look for is image quality differences. It's also important to note that we're seeing the difference between DLSS upscaling as well as Ray Reconstruction compared to FSR 4 upscaling as well as Ray Regeneration. So it's kind of both things at the same time because you would be using them both together. So it's not isolating for Ray Regeneration versus Ray Reconstruction because the upscale is also involved. So if you look at things like the details in the trees in the background and things like that, that would more likely, if there's differences there, that would more likely be due to the underlying upscalers, whereas if you see difference in ray traced reflections, that has more to do with the Ray Regeneration versus Ray Reconstruction. Now, in this particular scene, I'm not really noticing much different, but as we play forward here a little bit, keep your eye out for the swimming pool that we'll be seeing in just a second. So why was that not playing smoothly? Come on here, get playing smoothly. Oh no, are we going to be a little bit slow on our? Well, we're going to be going frame by frame anyway here. So what I want you to actually keep your eye on here is this edge of this swimming pool versus this edge of this swimming pool, because this is the first main difference I noticed. And again, I'm not sure if this is down to the underlying upscaler or the Ray Reconstruction versus Ray Regeneration. There is ray traced reflections on this swimming pool. I think actually on the left-hand side with DLSS on the 5070 Ti, it looks less stable on the edge of that pool as I play this forward. So watch as we hit play on the edge of this swimming pool. That looks a little bit unstable. Again, watch as it kind of moves forward again here. for some instability. I do think that there's a little bit more of a sparkle to those that, again, kind of looks a little bit like a little bit of instability rather than what it maybe should actually look like. Now, if we go frame by frame here to actually look at the ray traced reflections on the water as we go through here, though, there are differences. I feel like this on the ray regeneration side, maybe this looks a little bit smoother. On the ray reconstruction side, maybe there's a little bit more waviness to the edges of that reflection. But as far as which one is more accurate, it's actually a little bit hard to say, because it's possible that you could over smooth things when it actually should be a little bit more ripply, because we are talking about water here, right? So that is something to just keep in mind as we go. So also we'll kind of go frame by frame here in slow motion, so you can kind of compare that in motion but slowly. So yeah, there's definitely some differences to the image quality, but I'm not seeing one of them just stand out as just obviously way better than the other one. All right, let's play forward a little bit more, a little bit quicker here. Also, I should mention, when you see screen tearing like this, I'm not locking these to 60 FPS capture to sync up to the recording, so that's why you will see screen tearing. So screen tearing is just a recording artifact due to the fact that we're not recording locked to 60 FPS. And you're watching a 60 FPS recording, if that makes sense. The game's out of sync with that recording, so that's why we're seeing that those are happening. So that's not something that you would see in person on a variable refresh rate display, so do just keep that in mind. Okay, here we had some ray traced reflections in puddles right here. Again, we can kind of inch through it a little bit. I would say that I feel like I can see the bamboo a little bit more here on the left-hand side in those puddles. Now, despite this being a built-in benchmark run that's supposed to be identical, sometimes there can be some slight differences run to run, but I do feel like I see more bamboo in the ray-traced reflections in the puddle here on the left-hand side of the screen. So yeah, I'm just calling out the differences as I'm seeing them. So let's go ahead and let it play here. Again, if we pause at any given moment when there's not really ray traced reflections here, I'm not seeing massive differences to write home about. Most of the differences would, I think, be down to the differences just between the upscalers, right? We have the FSR 4 versus DLSS 4 transformer model. Both of them are doing a pretty good job, I would say, with this upscale to a 4K output from performance mode upscaling is coming from a 1080p input resolution. Now, I know that right here, there's a bunch more ray traced reflections on the floor, so this would be another good one to look at. So yeah, there's certainly differences between the ray traced reflections on the floor. As far as where am I looking at here, I'm looking at especially things like this right here versus this right here. Although notice, I feel like there's some lighting differences. And again, I'm wondering, is some of that down to a run-to-run difference between the runs here? Because again, this is a built-in benchmark, which is ideally playing exactly the same thing, but there's certainly an overall lighting difference in this room. So just certainly something to point out in addition to the reflections. I'm not quite sure why we're getting that, but it's certainly there. Now, the ray trace reflections on the floor, I mean, we can certainly see differences between them. I do think to my taste, I think this side might look a little bit better here, but both are looking pretty good. I think I'm kind of reaching to find any real noticeable difference to call out. And do keep in mind, again, that if you're actually just playing the game, let's watch this more in like real-time speed, you're really gonna barely see that. Like it's just almost instantly gone as you come through here. So there's a difference between staring at the floor, trying to find differences in the reflections versus stuff you would notice in actual gameplay. But again, if we do pause and try to look for differences here, we can see there's the more puddle reflections here. We've got this line here. We've got this line reflecting here. Am I seeing more of the line reconstructed here with ray reconstruction versus ray regeneration? Maybe a tiny little bit. But again, I would say that both are looking like very good ray traced reflections. So yeah, it does look like AMD's doing a nice job here with these. Again, as we move forward, there's some reflections in the window here. I'm not noticing huge differences. They also don't seem super high resolution, so I'm actually wondering if those are even might actually be SSR rather than ray traced, because I think the game uses a mix of SSR and ray tracing, from what I can tell in the reflections, depending on what in particular you're looking at. I mean, we have things here like these bricks. Those might have a bit of ray traced reflection on them. I can't say I can really spot much of a noticeable difference between the two. So overall, again, we got some water here. Okay, we have the enemy character reflecting in the water. I mean, would you say that silhouette shadow of that character looks maybe slightly sharper than this one? But again, is pin sharp even correct when you're thinking about like what would water actually look like? So there's certainly some minor differences between the two, but nothing to me that's standing out as, wow, that is just massively better between one and the other. Again, as we kind of go through here. Now, another thing to look at here is the difference in the water in the background here versus here. Because I do definitely see some differences in that. Now, that might not be ray regeneration versus ray reconstruction, because I'm not sure the distant water is actually getting ray traced reflections. So that can also just be a difference between the DLSS transformer model upscale versus the FSR4 upscale. But let's go ahead and play this bit here and kind of see what we see. I do think that there was some temporal instability happening here that I'm not seeing as much of here. So I do think I'm preferring the image on that side of the screen kind of in motion with the temporal stability as we watch that explosion. I'm not sure it's a massive difference, but I'm certainly noticing it. Now, the next thing that I wanted to look at here, notice that I now actually have ray reconstruction and ray regeneration turned off. So this, and I also have upscaling completely turned off. So this is now an apples to apples comparison of none of the, upscaling or reconstruction techniques. This is native resolution with the default denoiser with upscaling turned off. So that's what we're looking at here. Now, one thing to note, I wanted to check for performance differences. By the end of this benchmark run, I still have the 9070 XT measuring 14% faster. So that's important information because that's saying that the performance differential with all of the upscaling turned on is the same performance differential with it turned off. So it wasn't heavier for one GPU than the other to be using the upscaling and ray reconstruction and ray regeneration. They seem to have had, they have scaled proportionally, if that makes sense. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to run this test. In fact, it was the main reason I wanted to run this test. The other thing you could look at here is just like the image quality of certain things. But since I'm not side by side with the upscaled and ray reconstructed versions, it's not quite as useful. But I will say, I do think like the swimming pool reflections and things actually look worse right now and less stable for both GPUs than they did when they were upscaled in performance mode using ray reconstruction and ray regeneration. So while I don't have that side by side against it, I have looked at that, and I do think it's the case that actually the upscales and ray regeneration and ray reconstruction both look better than the native and default denoiser in this game. So that's at least interesting. Now notice that the performance here isn't anything you would use anyway. They're both around 30 FPS. The 9070 XT is slightly above 30 FPS average, and the 5070 Ti is slightly below 30 FPS average. So again, especially in this kind of competitive multiplayer game, really just not settings you'd be using. So I think I'm going to go ahead and skip forward. And the next thing I wanted to look at here is this is 1440p, and we're back to using upscaling. So at 1440p, I've chose to use, let's go forward here a little bit. So at 1440p, I've elected to use balanced upscaling rather than performance mode, because that's more like what I would probably actually use in a realistic use. And again, it's DLSS4 transformer ray reconstruction on the left versus FSR4 ray reconstruction on the right, both at their balanced upscale. This is 1440p output. Notice the 9070 XT has now jumped to 21% faster, so it is noticeably faster in this game, and faster at 1440p than it was at 4K relative to the 5070 Ti. Once again, after we look at with upscaling, we'll look at it with the upscaling turned off for the performance difference. Now, I'm looking at the the edge of the swimming pool again, and I think you guys would probably agree that it looks a little bit less stable as it kind of pans in motion there, right? Would you guys agree that on the left-hand side of the screen, the edge of that pool looks a little bit flickery? So that's certainly I would say, advantage on the right-hand side there for AMD in this. The swimming pool reflections, I don't know. Like, it's a little hard to say. I do think there's different characteristic to the reflections here. To me, the one on the right looks a little bit more muted. These, I think the highlights seem to like shine and sparkle just a little bit more. I think I prefer the look of the left-hand side a little bit to the right-hand side, but again, we're kind of nitpicking details by still screenshots here. But I do think that I might slightly prefer the look on the left-hand side of the screen. I do think there's a little more sparkliness that might almost appear like instability to me on the left, though, when I'm looking at these kind of water caustics. I don't think these are ray traced caustic effects. I don't think that's ray traced, but I think just the overall image I'm getting out of that, I don't know. There's some weird looking sparkles on both the left and the right. Maybe just a little bit more on the left, though. Going through here again, we can look at the top of the water for those ray traced reflections. Again, I think it's similar to what we saw at 4K, where I feel like on the left, I'm seeing increased amount of rippliness along this edge, where this edge looks smoother. But given the nature of the water we're reflecting off of, it's, again, hard for me to say which one would actually be more accurate. And in real world use case where you're just playing the game at full speed, I just don't think you're really going to notice that too much. Again, when there's not ray traced reflections on anything, I'm not noticing huge differences between the image quality, which again, I would say is actually a pretty good thing to say about FSR 4 here, is the fact that it's holding up pretty well image quality with the NVIDIA option. Now, once again, on these puddles, I feel like I'm seeing more of the what is that, bamboo reflected in the puddle on the left than I am on the right. Not quite sure why exactly that's the case, but I noticed that on the 4K upscale as well. So the fact that we're seeing it twice reduces the chance that that was just run-to-run variance. Again, look at this angle on the puddles right now. I think there's a lot more reflection happening here than here. So that is, I think, worth noting. Because that's one of the larger differences I've been able to notice between the two so far. Again, as we go through here without any real reflection stuff happening, not too many differences, but as we come in here, this floor has a bunch of reflection on it, so we can look at it again. Now, once again, I'm noticing that this seems a lot brighter here, like there's a lighting difference between here, and this is again consistent with what we saw at 4K. So again, reducing the chance that that's just like a run-to-run variance thing in the built-in benchmark. So I think that that's, again, at least interesting to note. Again, I do think there's some differences in the characteristics on these puddles. By the way, if you're watching on mobile on a phone screen in the YouTube app, you can pinch to zoom on things. Anyway, on larger monitors, I think this should be kind of apparent on its own. Yeah, there's definitely some differences to these. Like, I feel like this looks a little bit more diffuse, and this looks a little bit more sharp and clear. Again, we're reflecting off of a surface that's not completely flat, though. So once again, what actually is the more correct representation? I think I prefer the left a little bit here. And again, which lighting is more correct here either? Again, because the lighting looks different. But again, I'm not 100% sure which one is more correct to the space. Again, we can see some further reflections like here versus here. There are definitely differences to the characteristics. Wow, we went a little too fast there for a second. There's definitely some differences to those characteristics. It's, like I said, though, I feel like a broken record. There's it can be hard to say which one is technically more accurate, right? Here, once again, I'm seeing some differences to the reflection of this character here and this character here. This one certainly looks darker and more defined. This one looks lighter and less defined. So I think I'm preferring the one on the left. Again, we're reflecting in a puddle in motion, so there could be some questions on what should be more accurate. I mean, this clearly looks a little more sharp right here compared to here, though. So I do think I'm preferring the image on the left, and there's certainly differences between them. Again, pausing it there, you're still seeing, like I said, some small differences between those reflections. As we move through here, we can see the edges on the water and all of that. Again, not sure how much of that water is ray traced reflection right now, but we can at least see differences in the upscale, I guess. And once again, I feel like on the right, it's a little bit less stable during the explosion. So I think I prefer the left. Now, this benchmark is now turning off all of the upscaling and ray reconstruction and ray regeneration. But again, we're at 1440p now, extreme settings RT high. The main purpose of this was to once again check if the performance differential remained about the same at 1440p with upscaling versus not upscaling. And that's pretty much what we're seeing. It's a 20% 9070 XT lead here performance-wise. When they're running completely apples to apples. And what was it, about a 21% difference when they were using all of the upscaling? If I go back a second, we'll see the performance differential there. Yeah, so it's 21% faster when we're using all of the upscaling and ray reconstruction and ray regeneration on both. And then it drops to 20% faster, so really just kind of margin of error, not a major difference here. So in other words, what we're really getting out of this test that I'm showing here is just that the performance differential stays about the same. AMD's about 20% faster at 1440p at the maximum graphic settings, whether or not you're using the upscaling. Once again, just getting a little look at the image quality at native. And once again, I actually do think like the upscalers with the ray reconstruction and ray regeneration were producing more defined reflections than what we're seeing here. So again, it's really saying something for how far the upscaling has come. Because I do think this is a case where the upscaled images are looking better than the native image with the default denoiser and like TAA and such. So anyway, let's go ahead and skip forward a little bit here to the next test. So the next test here is 1080p. I think I went a little bit farther than I want to. So now we are looking at 1080p. Extreme settings RT high, but we're back to upscaling again with ray reconstruction and ray regeneration. For 1080p output, I don't like to go more aggressive than a quality upscale, so that's what we're seeing here. So quality upscaling now, but 1080p output. As the resolution drops, AMD's lead seems to increase. It's now 27% faster. Again, this is with all of the features turned on, and once again, we'll look at a comparison of it with the features turned off. So how about the edge of the swimming pool? That was one of the places we were noticing a difference. So let's go ahead and play that a little bit. Yeah, once again, even at 1080p, I think I'm noticing the same thing, where it's a little bit more flickery and unstable on the left. So I think that's an image quality win for AMD. Looking at the top of the pool in this scene, I'm once again think I prefer the left-hand side of the screen a bit for NVIDIA's option. Again, I think we're just getting a little bit, these just look a little bit more diffuse. And a little, and like the highlights here just seem a little bit more crisp. Again, there's the question of what's more accurate to the actual situation, but I think to my eye, I prefer the look of the left-hand side of the screen here. So that's something to mention. Again, we have the underwater, like water bits and everything. Again, I think there's more of those sparkles that I don't really like on the left. Again, as we look at the water here, I think we're seeing similar things to what we saw at the other resolutions, where I think the AMD image is a little smoother, the NVIDIA image has more ripples to it, but the increased rippliness might be more correct to the water surface that we're reflecting off of. So anyway, again, hard to say. Let's keep moving forward here, see if we spot anything. Again, in the scenes without clear ray traced reflections, both upscalers are looking really good on a quality level upscale to a 1080p output. So without the ray reconstruction, ray regeneration entering really into it, I'm not seeing huge differences here. Again, though, as we come up the steps, I really think we're getting a lot better reflections on the left-hand side of the screen here from the bamboo in this water, not really getting much of a reflection here. So I would say that looks better on the left-hand side for NVIDIA, in my opinion. Again, here without much in the way of reflections, not noticing much in the way of differences. As we round the bend here, Let's go back once again. So again, reducing the chance of this having been a run-to-run variance thing. Look at the lighting difference here. Way brighter lighting here, less bright lighting here. So major differences on that. And once again, I think that we're seeing more pin-sharp reflections on the left and a little more diffuse reflections on the right. Again, to my eye, I think I prefer what we're seeing on the left, but both are looking good. And like I said, you know, there's arguments to which is more accurate based on the actual materials on the floor. Again, you can look at those chairs on the left. Really seeing similar stuff to what we saw at the other resolutions. Now here, I feel like the left is getting us more of the reflection of this line here, right? This line reflected here versus this line reflected here. Now this is one particular frame, but we can kind of go frame by frame and notice that that seems consistently the case. So I do think that the ray reconstruction is reconstructing more of that line reflection, which I think should be there given the image that we're looking at. So I do think that that's a bit of a win for the ray reconstruction on the left-hand side of the screen. So there's that. Let's go ahead and kind of play this out. Again, not noticing anything too crazy when there's not clear ray traced reflections going on. Okay, the reflections here, I'm noticing the same kind of stuff we saw at the other resolutions, where this looks a little more pin sharp and detailed. This looks a little more diffuse and less detailed. Both look good. Again, there's arguments on, you know, what's more technically accurate. I do think the left-hand side looks better, though. So I would call it a win for the ray reconstruction for NVIDIA there. Again, differences in the water here. I feel like we're seeing more detail in the water above the fence line on the left-hand side, and it's a little less stable on the right-hand side. That could be a difference in the DLSS 4 transformer model, just though, as opposed to the reconstruction effort differences. So do keep that in mind. But I do think that this scene looks better on the left and more stable. So yeah, actually some weird flickeriness happening there. Now this test we just switched to is again turning off the upscaling, turning off the ray reconstruction and ray regeneration. Native res default denoiser, apples to apples, 9070 XT is 26% faster. So once again, we're noticing that the performance lead doesn't really change noticeably when turning on or off those features. And that was the main reason to run this test. But again, one of my issues with this whole thing, if we just kind of let things run, is the fact that we only have one game to test right now, and this is a game where I just don't think most people would be maxing out the graphic settings. I mean, these are expensive GPUs. We're at 1080p native here. We're looking at 60 FP, you know, mid 60s versus mid 80s when we're talking FPS here. Neither of those are really the kinds of performance I would want to be using on these types of GPUs. So just notice that what we're looking at here is what if I just ran native 1080p resolution with no ray tracing and no upscaling. And I ran it at basic settings instead of extreme with ray tracing on. So RT off, basic settings. This is more like how I think people would actually be using this game for competitive multiplayer. And here we're seeing 356 FPS versus 287. Where both are extremely fast. AMD is certainly faster, in this case by 24%. But again, I really just think that this is more like how people will actually be playing this particular game. Or if you're using upscaling, you might do it on already reduced settings, which is what I'm looking at here. So if we look at 1080p basic, RT off, but with quality level upscaling, now we're seeing AMD increase its lead to 30%. It was at 24% when they were running it native. But we're talking, again, hundreds of FPS for both GPUs. So there's that. Anyway, so I think this, like I said, is more representative of, I think, how people actually play the game. Now, notice that we're not getting a lot of the graphical details that we got when we were looking at this with, you know, maxed out settings plus ray tracing. So there is differences there, but yeah, I just think this is more realistic to how people would actually be playing the game. If we switch over to 1440p basic settings with ray tracing turned off, again, both GPUs are good for hundreds of FPS. The 9070 XT is 24% faster though. Again, you're not getting those nice reflections and everything, but if you're just playing the game for competitive purposes, right, like, again, I just think this is more like how people would play the game. Now, you're certainly missing all those, you know, floor reflections and everything like that here. This scene certainly looks different. You know, so it's not that those weren't adding something to the image, But like I said, this is more like how I think people would be playing the game. AMD is 24% faster at 1440p native, and then when we switch to upscaling, using balanced level upscaling, but again at 1440p basic settings with no ray tracing, the 9070 XT ends up 27% faster here. And then I did also test out 4K if we skip ahead far enough here. So 4K native basic settings RT off, I had the 9070 XT 22% faster, and both are definitely playable here, well over 100 FPS, even at native 4K, but then if we do kick on performance mode upscaling at 4K, then we're getting a 20% lead for the 9070 XT and, higher performance overall. So there's some additional testing of how you'd probably actually be playing the game on these cards. So this game is clearly an AMD favored title. So when you look at the performance differences, do keep that in mind, right? Even with ray tracing on, it seemed like an AMD favored title. The 9070 XT and the 5070 Ti on average in a lot of games tend to average out to similar performance, plus or minus 5% depending on the game set that you choose. So do keep that in mind when looking at this. Also, again, this game only has ray traced reflections, whereas I think ray reconstruction also is really going to be important to test out with ray traced lighting, like global illumination. So I really want to see AMD get this into more games, and I want to look at it in like path tracing games like Cyberpunk. So I'm hoping we start to see this increase the number of games that it's in. In its current state, it looks like it. There were some image quality differences between the two, and I would say overall, I would give the edge to DLSS ray reconstruction, but AMD was certainly putting up a good fight. And there were certain scenes like that swimming pool where I thought the AMD upscale was looking a little bit better. Now remember that this is what the default denoiser looks like in this game. This is what AMD's ray regeneration looks like. So you can tell that AMD has taken a huge step forward with this, even if I felt like overall the image quality from ray reconstruction on average was delivering sharper looking reflections in this game. Anyway, this is a nice step forward for AMD. Like I said, based on one game, it's hard to make any definitive calls anyway. If I had to make a call, I would say ray reconstruction's a bit better. But like I said, there were scenes where the AMD side did look a little bit better as well. It's nice to see AMD putting up a fight with all of this. I want to see the rest of their FSR Redstone feature set come out, because I think before we look at this in path tracing titles like Cyberpunk or something like that, AMD probably also wants to have their neural radiance caching ready to go so we can see more of the full feature set. So anyway, hopefully we do get the full FSR Redstone suite available in some games soon, but this was what we can test out so far. Hopefully you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Yeah, that's what I have for you guys today. Hope all of you have an excellent day.